Everyone laughed at the mountain man for marrying a fat widow, but then he did. The whole town laughed at the mountain man for marrying a fat widow. They said he'd lost his mind, that no real man would marry her. But out in the Colorado highlands, under a sky heavy with snow, something no one expected began to happen. The man they mocked found peace where bullets and loneliness had once ruled his life. And the woman they ridiculed? She carried a secret that could save or destroy the entire valley. When the railroad men came with forged papers and fire in their hands, the laughter turned to fear. Because that fat widow owned the only hot spring left unfrozen in winter, and they'd do anything to take it. Now, as smoke rises over the mountains and faith is tested by greed, when the world mocks love and mercy, who dares to stand for what's right, no matter the cost? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The wooden pews creaked as the congregation shifted and whispered. Winter sunlight filtered through the church's frosted windows, casting weak shadows across the worn floorboards. At the altar, Isaac Creed stood like an oak tree beside Ella Mae Garrison, his massive frame making her seem even smaller than her plump figure already appeared. Reverend Thompson's voice carried through the drafty church. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Ella's hands trembled as she clutched her small bouquet of dried winter flowers. She could hear the whispers behind her, feel the judgment in every murmured word. Her cheeks burned with a mixture of shame and disbelief. After James Garrison's disgrace and death, she never thought anyone would want her as a wife again. "Did you see the size difference?" Someone whispered too loudly. "Bear and a butterball," another voice answered, followed by poorly stifled laughter. Isaac remained steady beside her, his weathered face set in peaceful lines. His calloused hand was gentle when he took hers, and his deep voice was clear and unwavering as he repeated his vows. Ella struggled to keep her own voice from shaking as she promised herself to this mountain man she barely knew. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Thompson declared, his words echoing in the hushed church. Before the Reverend could finish saying, "You may kiss the bride," Isaac turned to face the congregation. His voice, usually so quiet, filled the church with calm authority. "She cooks kind, prays steady, and don't lie. That's wife enough for any man." The laughter died in shocked silence. Ella felt tears spring to her eyes, not from shame this time, but from the simple dignity in his words. Isaac's large hand found hers again, and he led her down the aisle. Their boots echoed on the wooden floor as they walked past the staring faces. Outside, snow was falling in thick, lazy flakes. Isaac's wagon waited at home, the bottom of the church steps, the mules stamping their hooves against the cold. He helped her up onto the seat with careful hands, making sure her heavy skirts were tucked around her legs, before covering her with a thick buffalo robe. As they drove down the main street of Mercy's Bluff, more laughter followed them. Some children even threw snowballs, though they fell short of the wagon. Ella kept her eyes fixed on her hands, twisting in her lap. "Don't pay them no mind," Isaac said softly, his first words to her since his declaration in the church. "They'll tire of it soon enough." The wagon creaked as they left the town behind, heading north towards the mountains that loomed against the gray winter sky. Ella watched the lamplights of Mercy's Bluff grow smaller and dimmer through the falling snow. Each light represented a window, behind which someone was probably still laughing about the odd couple who'd married that morning. The snow fell harder as they traveled, but Isaac handled the reins with sure hands. He knew these roads well, having traveled them countless times with his furs and trading goods. The mules picked their way carefully along the snowy trail, their breath steaming in the cold air. Ella stole glances at her new husband's profile. His beard was neat but full, shot through with gray, and his eyes were fixed steadily on the trail ahead. She'd seen him in town sometimes, bringing his furs to trade, but they'd never spoken until 3 weeks ago, when he'd stopped her outside the general store. "Ms. Garrison," he'd said then, hat in his hands, "I've watched you a spell. You're alone, and so am I. I've got a good cabin, hunting's fine, and I reckon we could help each other. Would you consider marriage?" It hadn't been romantic, but it had been honest. Like everything else about Isaac Creed seemed to be. The wagon jolted over a frozen rut, bringing Ella back to the present. She realized she was shivering despite the buffalo robe. Isaac noticed immediately and reached beneath the seat, pulling out another blanket which he tucked around her with one hand. "Thank you," she said softly. "Need to keep you warm," he replied. "It's a fair piece to the cabin yet." The snow continued to fall as they climbed higher into the foothills. The wind picked up, making the bare branches of the trees crack and moan. Ella huddled deeper under the blankets, watching as the familiar landscape of her life disappeared into the whiteness behind them. "Why did you choose me?" she asked suddenly, the question that had been burning in her mind finally finding voice. "You must have known what people would say." Isaac was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was thoughtful. "Seen you at church every Sunday, rain or shine. Seen how you helped old widow Jenkins with her marketing even when folks was talking cruel about your husband's debts. Watched you keep your head high when lesser folk would have run away." He adjusted the reins in his hands. Reckoned that was the kind of strength a man could admire. Ella felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the blankets. "I'm not very pretty," she said, voicing another fear. "Pretty is as pretty does," Isaac replied simply. "Known too many pretty faces with ugly hearts." The wagon continued to climb, and Ella found herself studying the passing landscape with growing interest. The snow-covered pines stood like sentinels against the gray sky. Here and there, tracks in the snow showed where deer or rabbits had passed. It was wild country, but there was a beauty to it she'd never noticed from town. "There's a spring near the cabin," Isaac said after a while. "Never freezes, even in the coldest winter. Good for washing and cooking." He paused. "Might be nice to have fresh bread again. Been a while since I had any but my own making." Ella smiled slightly. "I do make good bread." "So I heard tell." His mouth twitched under his beard in what might have been a smile of his own. The wind grew sharper as they climbed, but Isaac kept the mules steady on the trail. Ella noticed how he handled the reins with the same quiet confidence he'd shown in the church. There was something comforting about his calm presence, like a shelter in the storm. As the afternoon wore on, the snow began to ease. Through breaks in the clouds, Ella caught glimpses of the valley below, Mercy's Bluff now just a tiny collection of buildings in the distance. She found she didn't mind watching it disappear. The town held too many memories of James's gambling, of the whispers and stares after his death, of the lonely months trying to make ends meet with sewing and baking. "Almost home," Isaac said as they rounded a bend in the trail. "Cabin's just beyond that stand of pines." Home. The word echoed in Ella's mind. She hadn't had a real home since James lost their house to his debts. The small room she'd rented above the millinery shop had been just a place to sleep, nothing more. The mule's pace quickened slightly, sensing the end of their journey. As they passed through the pines, Ella caught her first glimpse of Isaac's cabin. It was larger than she'd expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney. Smoke rose from the chimney in a steady stream. "Asked my neighbor Tom Blue Hawk to lay a fire this morning," Isaac explained, seeing her questioning look. "Didn't want you coming to a cold house." The thoughtfulness of this gesture brought fresh tears to Ella's eyes, which she blinked away quickly. The wagon came to a stop in front of the cabin, and Isaac helped her down with the same careful hands he'd used at the church. Her feet crunched in the fresh snow as she looked around at what would be her new home. Behind the cabin, the mountain rose steep and majestic. A creek ran nearby. She could hear it burbling under its crust of ice. A well-built barn stood to one side, and she could see a chicken coop and what looked like a good-sized vegetable garden, now sleeping under the snow. "It ain't much," Isaac said, suddenly sounding uncertain for the first time. "But it's solid built, and the roof don't leak." Ella turned to look at him, this bear of a man who had defended her so simply in church, who had thought to have a fire laid so she wouldn't come to a cold home. "It's more than I've had in a long while," she said honestly. Isaac nodded, relief showing briefly in his eyes. "Best get you inside while I tend to the mules." He carried her small trunk to the cabin door, then paused with his hand on the latch. "Welcome home, Ms. Creed." The sound of her new name brought a fresh warmth to Ella's heart. As Isaac opened the door, she saw that the cabin was neat and clean, if plain. A fire burned welcomingly in the stone fireplace, and she could see a kitchen area with a good cook stove. Everything was simple but well made, like Isaac himself. A couple of her dried flowers had survived the journey, still clutched in her hand. As Isaac went back out to the barn, Ella placed them in a tin cup on the table, a small touch of beauty in her new home. Outside, she could hear him talking quietly to the mules as he unharnessed them. The laughter of Mercy's Bluff seemed very far away now, as distant as the town itself. Here in this mountain cabin, with a good man who valued kindness and honesty above appearances, Ella felt something she hadn't expected to feel on this day: hope. The wagon creaked and swayed as Isaac guided the mules along the winding mountain trail. Ella held tight to the wooden seat, the borrowed quilt wrapped snugly around her shoulders. Each jolt of the wheels sent a shiver through the wagon's frame, making her grip tighter. The path grew steeper, cutting through valleys thick with frost-laden pines that stretched endlessly upward into the gray winter sky. Snow had started falling again, adding fresh powder to the already treacherous trail. Ella watched as Isaac's large hands worked the reins with surprising gentleness, keeping the mules steady on the slippery ground. He hadn't spoken much since they'd left town, but she noticed how his eyes constantly scanned the path ahead, seeking the safest route for wagon and passengers alike. The cold bit through her layers of clothing despite the quilt. Ella tucked her hands deeper into the folds of fabric, trying to warm them. Her wedding ring, a simple brass band Isaac had given her during the ceremony, felt icy against her finger. The memory of laughing faces in the church made her cheeks burn, even now, hours later. As they rounded a bend, the wagon wheel caught on a frozen rut, jerking them sharply. Ella gasped, but Isaac steadied the team with a quiet word. "Easy there," he murmured to the mules. His voice, though rarely used, was deep and gentle. Near midday, Isaac drew the wagon to a stop beside a half-frozen creek. The water still moved beneath a lacework of ice, its sound muffled but persistent. "Need to rest the team," he said, setting the brake. "Might warm ourselves a spell, too." He climbed down first, his boots crunching in the snow. When he reached up to help Ella, his hands were strong and sure around her waist. Still, she stumbled slightly on the dismount, her legs stiff from sitting. Isaac caught her before she could fall, steadying her with those same careful hands. "Thank you," she whispered, embarrassed. "Ice is treacherous," he replied simply, as if her clumsiness were the most natural thing in the world. From beneath the wagon seat, Isaac produced a cloth-wrapped package and a battered coffee pot. He quickly gathered some dry wood from beneath a fallen log, and soon had a small fire crackling. While snow melted in the pot for coffee, he opened the package to reveal strips of dried venison. "Ain't much," he said, offering her the jerky, "but it'll keep your strength up." Ella accepted a piece, watching as he moved around the fire with practiced efficiency. There was nothing cruel in his manner, she realized. Only a quiet sort of competence that spoke of years living alone in these mountains. The coffee, when it was ready, was strong and hot. Isaac handed her a tin cup, making sure she had a firm grip before letting go. The warmth of the metal seeped into her cold fingers as she sipped gratefully. "More?" he asked when she'd finished, already reaching for the pot. "Please," she nodded, surprised by his attentiveness. They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. Ella watched as Isaac spoke softly to the mules while checking their harnesses, patting their flanks, and offering them handfuls of oats from a canvas bag. The animals clearly trusted him, leaning into his touch with familiar ease. Too soon. It was time to move on. Isaac stamped out the fire thoroughly, scattering snow over the ashes. He helped Ella back into the wagon with the same care he'd shown before, making sure the quilt was tucked securely around her before taking up the reins again. The afternoon wore on as they climbed higher into the mountains. The trail grew narrower, hugging the curves of the land. Through gaps in the trees, Ella caught glimpses of vast valleys falling away below them, all blanketed in white. The wind grew sharper, carrying the clean scent of pine and snow. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Isaac pointed ahead. "Nearly there," he said. "Cabin's just around this bend." Ella leaned forward slightly, eager for her first sight of her new home. As they rounded the curve, the trees opened up to reveal a clearing. There, set back from the edge of a steep slope, stood a sturdy log cabin. Steam rose from a creek that ran nearby, creating ghostly shapes in the cold air. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, promising warmth within. Isaac drew the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin. Ella took in the details of the homestead while he set the brake. A well-built corral stood to one side, its posts solid despite the weather. Neatly stacked, firewood lined the cabin's western wall, enough to last through the worst of winter. Above the door, a wooden cross had been carefully carved and mounted, its simple lines speaking of devotion rather than decoration. "Tom Bluehawk laid a fire this morning," Isaac explained as he helped her down. This time when she stumbled, his catch was immediate and gentle. "Wanted the place warm for you." The inside of the cabin was sparse but tidy. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. A cook stove stood in one corner, its black iron surface gleaming. Simple furnishings, a table, chairs, a cupboard, showed signs of careful craftsmanship. Everything had its place, speaking of a life lived with purpose, if not luxury. "Bedroom's through there," Isaac said, gesturing to a door on the far wall. "Put up fresh curtains last week. Made sure there were clean sheets, too." He paused, suddenly seeming uncertain. "Thought you might want to unpack your things. Get settled." Ella stood in the center of the main room, holding her small carpet bag close. The enormity of the change in her life pressed in around her. This morning, she had been Ella Mae Garrison, widow of a gambling man, living in a tiny rented room above the millinery shop. Now she was Ella Mae Creed, wife to a mountain man, mistress of a cabin in the wilderness. Isaac carried her trunk into the bedroom, setting it carefully beside a solid wooden bed. A patchwork quilt in blues and browns covered the mattress, and white muslin curtains hung at the window. Like everything else, it was simple but well made. "Thank you," she said softly, "for thinking of the curtains and the sheets. Wanted it to be proper for you." He hesitated in the doorway. "I know this ain't what you're used to. Know it's far from town and all. But I aim to be a good husband to you, Ella May. Thank you for trusting me enough to try." The words caught in her throat, but she had to speak them. "I just didn't have anywhere else." Instead of taking offense, Isaac nodded slowly. Sometimes that's how the Lord works. Brings folks together when they're both needing something, even if it ain't what they expected. Outside, a coyote's cry echoed through the gathering dusk. Another answered, the sound wild and lonely. Snow fell more heavily now, thick flakes swirling past the windows. But inside the cabin the fire crackled steadily, and the walls held firm against the wind. Ella watched as Isaac moved toward the door. "I'll see to the mules," he said. "Get them settled for the night. Take your time with your unpacking. There's coffee in the pot on the stove if you want it." When he had gone, Ella sank onto the edge of the bed. Her fingers traced the careful stitching of the quilt as she listened to the sounds of her new life. The pop of the fire, the whisper of snow against the windows, the distant murmur of Isaac's voice as he tended to his animals. Nothing was familiar, and yet something about it, all felt right. Not like an ending, but like a beginning. The pale winter sun had barely crested the eastern ridge when Ella woke to the crisp scent of pine smoke drifting through the cabin. She lay still for a moment, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and settling sounds of her new home. Through the bedroom's small window, frost patterns sparkled on the glass, catching the early morning light like delicate lace. The floorboards were cold beneath her feet as she dressed quickly, pulling on her warmest woolen dress and a shawl. In the main room, the fire had already been built up, flames dancing merrily in the stone fireplace. Isaac's boots were gone from their place by the door. He must have risen before dawn. Ella took stock of the kitchen area, determined to prove her worth on this first morning. The cast-iron stove gleamed, already warm from Isaac's morning fire. She found a sack of flour in the cupboard, along with some eggs and a precious jar of molasses. Flapjacks would make a proper breakfast, she decided. It had been months since she'd had a real kitchen to cook in, but surely her hands remembered the way. The first batch burned black as coal, sticking stubbornly to the griddle. Ella scraped them off with grim determination, adjusting the heat. The second round came out better, though still darker than she'd like. She was working on a third batch when Isaac's heavy tread sounded on the porch. He stamped the snow from his boots before entering, bringing a rush of cold air with him. His arms were full of split wood, which he stacked neatly by the fireplace before turning to the stove. "Smells good," he said, though Ella knew the burnt smell still lingered. "The first ones didn't turn out," she admitted, flipping a flapjack that was, finally, turning golden brown. "But these are better." Isaac settled at the table without comment, accepting the plate she set before him. Ella poured coffee into 2 tin cups, remembering how he'd taken his the day before, black and strong. She watched anxiously as he took his first bite. "Coffee's just right," he said, reaching for the molasses. "Been a while since I had flapjacks." "Been a while since I cooked them," Ella replied, relieved he wasn't mentioning the scorched edges. She sat down across from him with her own plate, studying the man who was now her husband. In the morning light, she could see the silver threading through his dark hair, the weather-worn creases around his eyes. His hands were rough but careful as he handled the delicate cup. After breakfast, Isaac showed her the daily routine. The water barrel needed filling from the creek, a task that left Ella's arms aching after just 2 trips. Wood had to be split into kindling, The chicken coop checked for eggs, and the trap lines running along the creek needed inspection. "You don't have to help with all this," Isaac said when he saw her struggling with an armful of kindling. "I've managed alone before." "I aim to pull my weight," Ella insisted, though her soft hands were already showing signs of blisters. She had spent too many years being called useless by her first husband to accept idleness now. Isaac studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Might be easier if you wear these," he said, disappearing into the cabin. He returned with a pair of leather work gloves, well worn but sturdy. "They'll be too big, but better than nothing." The gloves were indeed enormous on her hands, but they saved her palms as she worked. Throughout the morning, she noticed Isaac watching her. Not with judgment, but with a quiet sort of appreciation. When she struggled to split a particularly knotted piece of wood, he didn't take over. Instead, he showed her how to find the grain, where to place the axe for the cleanest strike. By midday, Ella's muscles were trembling with exhaustion, but satisfaction warmed her chest. She had contributed something real, something needed. The water barrel was full, neat piles of kindling stood ready, and she had even learned to check the nearest trap lines without flinching at the sight of the caught rabbits. The short winter day faded quickly into evening. After a simple supper of beans and cornbread, they sat in the gathering darkness until Isaac lit the oil lamp. Its gentle glow created a small circle of warmth between them at the table. Perhaps it was the intimate lighting that loosened their tongues, or maybe it was the shared work of the day, but words came easier now. "Did you always live alone up here?" Ella asked, warming her hands around her coffee cup. Isaac shook his head slowly. "Had family once. Parents, sisters. Lost Pa to fever when I was young. Ma and the girls moved back east after that. I stayed on, learned trapping from old Jim Hawkins." He paused, considering. "Been mostly to myself these past years. Don't talk much to folks, except Tom Blue Hawk when he comes by to trade, or when I take furs into town." The admission seemed to open something between them. Ella found herself speaking of things she rarely shared. "My William, my first husband, he had a way with words. Could charm anyone. But he loved cards more than anything else." She traced the rim of her cup, remembering. "Lost everything, bit by bit. The house first, then the store. Even my mother's silver spoons in the end. When the consumption took him, I had nothing left but debt and shame." "Ain't shame in what someone else did," Isaac said firmly. "You survived it, built yourself back up." "Still building," Ella whispered, looking around at the solid log walls, the well-swept floor, the carefully arranged shelves. Everything here spoke of care and purpose, so different from the chaos William had brought to her life. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters against the cabin walls. Ella jumped slightly at a particularly loud gust, and Isaac rose to check the latch. "Storm's coming in strong," he said, returning to the table, "but these walls have weathered worse." He seemed to gather his courage before adding, "Been too quiet in here these past years. It's good, hearing a woman's voice again, having someone to share the evening with. Thank you for that, Ella May." The simple honesty of his words touched something deep in her heart. This man didn't speak often, but when he did, every word carried weight. Like everything else about him, the careful way he split wood, the gentle handling of his animals, the quiet strength in his hands, his gratitude was genuine. Outside, the wind continued its wild song, but inside the cabin, a different kind of warmth was growing. Not the sudden flash of passion or the empty promises Ella had known before, but something steadier. Something built on shared work, honest words, and the simple comfort of two people choosing to face the wilderness together. The lamp flame flickered as another gust shook the cabin. Isaac rose to add more wood to the fire, his movements sure in the dim light. Ella watched him, feeling the ache in her muscles from the day's work, the tender spots where blisters were forming on her hands. Good pain, she decided. The kind that came from being useful, from building something real. The howling wind and creaking timbers that had seemed so strange that morning now felt like a reminder of the shelter they had found. Not just from the storm, but from the loneliness that had driven them both to this unlikely marriage. As Isaac settled back into his chair, their silence was comfortable, filled with the promise of more days like this one, more evenings of quiet understanding. 3 days passed in a rhythm of shared work and quiet meals. The morning dawned clear but bitter cold when Isaac announced they needed supplies from town. Frost sparkled on the cabin windows as Ella wrapped herself in her best wool shawl, the dark blue one with only one small patch carefully hidden in the fold. "You don't have to come," Isaac said, watching her pin her hair neat beneath her bonnet. "Trail's mighty cold today." "I aim to," Ella replied, straightening her spine. "We need sugar too, and thread. Besides—" She hesitated, then lifted her chin. "I won't hide away like I'm ashamed." Isaac nodded, something like pride flickering in his eyes. He helped her into the wagon, tucking a warm buffalo hide around her legs before climbing up himself. The mule's breath came out in white puffs as they started down the mountain trail. The journey took longer than usual, with ice making the path treacherous. Isaac handled the reins with careful attention, while Ella watched the winter-bare trees pass by. Neither spoke much, but the silence between them had grown comfortable these past days. Mercy's Bluff looked different in the morning light, more stark than it had on their wedding day. The general store's bell jangled as they entered, bringing warmth and the familiar smells of coffee, leather, and tobacco. Ella kept her head high, though she felt the stares following, them between the crowded shelves. "Well, if it ain't the happy couple," the mocking voice carried clear across the store. Abner Klein lounged against the counter, his railroad foreman's coat unbuttoned despite the cold. His smile was sharp as a coyote's. "Tell me, Isaac, how's it feel trading your rifle for a cook?" Laughter rippled through the store. Ella's cheeks burned as she studied the shelf of salt boxes before her, but Isaac's presence beside her never wavered. He reached past her to select the largest box, his movements unhurried. "Mighty fine trade," he said simply, adding nails to their growing pile of supplies. His calm voice carried no challenge, yet something in it made several onlookers drop their eyes. Ella moved toward the thread display, her fingers trembling slightly as she selected sturdy brown spools. Behind her, she could hear snippets of conversation. "Miners' wells all freezing solid up Cedar Creek way. Can't work the claims without water. That worthless hot spring old Garrison used to crow about." Ella's hand froze on a spool of thread. William had indeed owned a hot spring, or claimed to. She remembered now. A folded paper in her wooden chest, something he'd won in a card game, and later tried unsuccessfully to sell. She'd kept it out of habit, along with all his other worthless papers. "That'll be $4.35, the shopkeeper announced, tallying their purchases. Isaac counted out the money carefully while Ella wrapped the supplies in brown paper. She could feel Abner Klein's calculating gaze following their movements. "Mighty cold winter we're having," he drawled. "Might be worth looking into any water sources that don't freeze. Railroad's always interested in reliable water stops." His words seemed casual, but something in his tone made Ella's spine stiffen. Isaac's hand settled briefly on her shoulder as they left the store. The touch was gentle but firm, a reminder that she wasn't alone anymore. Still, unease churned in her stomach as they loaded the wagon. The return journey felt longer. Snow had started falling again, thick flakes that caught on Ella's shawl and frosted the mule's mane. Isaac glanced at her troubled expression several times, but didn't press her to speak. The wagon creaked through fresh snow, passing the skeletal shapes of winter-bare aspens. Ella's thoughts tumbled like the snowflakes. That deed, could it be worth something after all? And if it was, what did that mean for her new life with Isaac? The hot spring lay somewhere on his mountain, she was certain. William had described it often enough. Steaming water that never froze, hidden in a high valley. They were halfway home when Isaac finally spoke. "Whatever's troubling you," he said quietly, "you can share it when you're ready." Ella nodded, grateful for his patience. The wagon continued up the mountain as the snow fell thicker, covering their tracks behind them. The deed waited in her chest, at home. But for now, she held her silence, watching the familiar shapes of Isaac's land emerge through the swirling white. The split rail fence, the smoke from their chimney, the sturdy cabin that was beginning to feel like home. The mule's hooves crunched through fresh snow as they approached the cabin. Whatever truth that deed might hold could wait until they'd unloaded the supplies and warmed themselves by the fire. For now, Ella focused on the present moment, the weight of Isaac's steady hand helping her down from the wagon, the creak of the cabin door opening to welcome them home, the promise of hot coffee warming on the stove. They worked together to store the supplies, salt in its bin, nails in their box, thread in the sewing basket. Each item found its proper place, just as Ella was finding hers in this mountain home. But even as she moved through these familiar tasks, that snippet of conversation about frozen wells and water rights echoed in her mind, along with the memory of Abner Klein's calculating stare. Evening settled over the mountain cabin like a heavy wool blanket. The windows glowed warm against the gathering dark, while inside, the fire crackled steadily in the stone hearth. Ella had just finished washing the supper dishes, venison stew and cornbread that Isaac had praised with his usual quiet sincerity. Now she stood before her cedar chest, running her fingers along its familiar scratches and nicks. The chest held everything she'd brought from her old life. 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, some faded letters, and William's papers. She hadn't looked through them since before the wedding. But now, thinking of the talk in town about frozen wells and water rights, she knew she had to check. "Mind if I look through some old papers?" she asked Isaac, who sat in his chair by the fire, mending a leather strap. He glanced up, needle paused mid-stitch. "Your things are your own, Ella. No need to ask." The chest's hinges creaked as she opened it. The familiar scent of cedar and lavender rose up, her mother's sachet still holding its sweetness after all these years. Ella lifted out her carefully folded clothes, setting them aside on the bed. Beneath lay the stack of papers, tied with faded ribbon. Her hands trembled slightly as she untied the bow. Most were William's gambling markers and unpaid bills, but near the bottom she found what she sought, a yellowed document, corners soft with age. The elaborate script at the top read, "Land title and deed of property." "Isaac?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I think you ought to see this." He set aside his work and crossed to where she sat on the floor beside the chest. Ella handed him the document, watching as he held it closer to the lamplight. His expression grew thoughtful as he read, brow furrowing beneath his beard. "This here's dated 3 years back," he said slowly. "Says the property includes 1 natural hot spring and adjacent creek, located in the eastern quarter of Mercy Valley." "That's..." He paused, looking down at her. "That's the very spring below us, Ella. The one that's been steaming all winter long." Ella's heart beat faster. William won it in a card game from a man named Thomas Burke. I remember because he came home so pleased with himself, sure it would make our fortune." She shook her head. "But nothing ever came of it. I thought it was worthless, like everything else he brought home." Isaac settled onto the floor beside her, the paper crackling softly as he smoothed it. "Notice here, the deed's signed over to your name, not his. William must have put it in your name to keep it safe from creditors." He pointed to her name, written in firm black ink. Ella May Garrison. "But what does it mean?" Ella asked, though understanding was already dawning. "About the spring never freezing?" Isaac's voice was careful, measured. "Means you own something rare in these mountains, water that runs year-round, no matter how cold it gets. That's worth more than gold to the right people." He folded the paper deliberately. "Especially with the miners' wells freezing up." Ella thought of Abner Klein's calculating look in the store, his casual words about water sources. "Should we tell someone?" "Not yet," Isaac said, helping her gather the scattered papers. "Best we check it proper first, make sure everything's legal and true. Tomorrow morning we'll ride down and have a look ourselves." They spent the rest of the evening quiet, each lost in thought. Ella's mind kept returning to the deed, now safely stored back in her chest. She'd owned this land all along, even when she thought herself destitute. The Lord did work in mysterious ways. Sleep came fitfully that night. Ella woke before dawn, the cabin still dark except for the banked coals in the fireplace. She built up the fire and started breakfast: coffee, bacon, and the last of yesterday's cornbread. By the time Isaac came in from feeding the stock, she had their food packed for the ride down to the spring. The morning was sharp and bright, the kind that made your breath freeze in your nose. Isaac saddled his steadiest horse for Ella, a gentle bay mare named Sister. He led them down a narrow trail that wound through snow-laden pines, their branches drooping under their white burden. "The spring's just ahead," Isaac said after they'd ridden about 20 minutes. "In that protected hollow below the ridge." Ella heard it before she saw it, a soft bubbling sound, strange among the winter silence. Then they rounded a bend, and there it was, a pool of clear water, steam rising from its surface like breath. Delicate ice crystals had formed around the edges where the warm water met the cold air, but the center remained open and flowing. Willows grew thick around the spring, their bare branches rimed with frost. A small creek led away from the pool, its channel open despite the freezing temperatures. Everything else in sight was locked in, winter's grip. But here, life continued flowing. Isaac helped her dismount, and they stood together at the spring's edge. Ella knelt and carefully touched the water. It was warm as bath water, carrying a faint mineral smell. "The Lord don't make mistakes," she whispered, watching the steam rise in the morning light. Isaac's hand settled on her shoulder. "No, ma'am," he agreed softly. "He surely don't." They spent the next hour exploring the area around the spring. Isaac showed her how the warm water kept the creek from freezing for nearly a quarter-mile downstream. He pointed out deer tracks and beaver sign near the banks, explaining how animals relied on the open water during winter. "Good water, too," he said, after tasting it. "Sweet and clean, not too much sulfur like some hot springs. Would serve well for stock or mining." Ella stood at the edge of the pool, watching the steam curl up toward the blue winter sky. Yesterday morning, she'd been just a widow who'd married a mountain man. Now she owned something valuable, something people needed. "What should we do?" she asked finally. Isaac considered before answering. "First we get this deed verified proper in town. Then we wait quiet-like, see what develops with them frozen wells." He helped her back onto Sister's saddle. No need to hurry. Water ain't going nowhere. They rode home in companionable silence, the horses' hooves crunching through the crusty snow. The morning sun had risen fully now, making the white landscape sparkle like diamond dust. Ella's mind was full of possibilities, but she felt strangely peaceful. Whatever came next, she and Isaac would face it together. Back at the cabin, they settled into their daily routine, feeding animals, hauling water, keeping the fire stoked against the cold. But something had shifted, subtle as spring beneath winter ice. Ella felt it as she worked, catching Isaac's thoughtful glances. They'd discovered more than just a warm spring today. They'd found hope, bubbling up unexpected as that water from the frozen ground. That evening, as Ella stirred the bean pot hanging over the fire, she noticed Isaac had spread out a map on the table. He was marking something with careful pencil strokes, the location of the spring, she realized, and the path of the creek that flowed from it. "Reckon we should know exactly what we're dealing with," he said, catching her watching. "Come spring, that water's going to mean something to a lot of folks." Ella nodded, understanding now why he'd counseled patience. They had time to think, to plan, to pray about the best way forward. The spring had waited all these years to be found. It could wait a little longer while they decided how best to use this gift. She served their supper, and they ate as usual, talking little. But the comfortable silence between them held new warmth, like the promise of that flowing water beneath the winter snow. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they had this moment. Two people who'd found each other against all odds, sharing bread and beans in a cabin on a mountainside, while below them, a miracle bubbled up from the frozen earth. The winter sun had just crested the mountain when Ella heard hoofbeats approaching the spring. She and Isaac had been working since dawn, placing wooden planks to channel the warm water into a holding pool they'd dug the day before. "Someone's coming," she whispered, straightening her back. The sound of horse and rider grew louder, crunching through week-old snow. Around the bend came Jim Tucker, a grizzled prospector known for working the high country claims. His mule picked its way carefully down the trail, steam rising from its flanks in the cold air. Tucker pulled up short when he spotted them, his rheumy eyes widening beneath his frost-covered beard. "Well now," he called out, his voice carrying in the crisp morning air. "Ain't this a sight? Heard tell of warm water up here, but didn't reckon to find folks working it already." Isaac straightened slowly, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the spring. "Morning, Tucker. Just doing some improving on our property." Tucker's gaze darted between them, lingering on Ella before settling on the steaming water. "Your property, you say?" He dismounted, leading his mule closer to the spring. "Mighty valuable piece of ground, especially with half the miners' wells frozen solid down valley." Ella felt her cheeks flush, not from the cold. She knew that calculating look, had seen it often enough on her late husband's face when he thought he'd spotted an opportunity. "We're blessed to have it," she said firmly, meeting Tucker's eyes. "The Lord provides." Tucker nodded, but his attention remained fixed on the spring. He dipped a tin cup into the water, sipped, and let out a low whistle. "Sweet water, too. Not like that sulfur stuff over in Mineral Creek." He mounted up again, touching the brim of his hat. "Much obliged for the drink. You folks have a good day now." They watched him ride away, his mule's tail switching in the cold air. Isaac shook his head slowly. "Won't be long now," he said quietly. He was right. By week's end, whispers had spread through Mercy's Bluff like wildfire. Ella heard them herself when she went to the mercantile for supplies, hushed conversations that stopped when she approached, sideways glances from women who'd never given her a second look before. "They're saying I found gold," she told Isaac that evening, kneading bread dough with more force than necessary. As if the good Lord hadn't blessed us enough with just the water itself. Isaac looked up from where he was mending a harness by the fire. People see what they want to see, he said, especially when times are hard. The next morning brought Abner Klein riding up their trail, his expensive eastern coat gleaming in the winter sun. He sat straight-backed on a sleek bay horse, looking every inch the successful railroad man he'd become. Two of his workers trailed behind him. "Mrs. Creed," he called out, his voice smooth as creek ice. "Mr. Creed, I hope you'll pardon the intrusion, but I wanted to discuss a business proposition regarding your spring." Ella felt Isaac tense beside her. They'd been expecting this visit, though not quite so soon. "This isn't a good time," Isaac said, his voice level but firm. "We're still getting settled." Klein's smile didn't waver. Of course. But surely you realize the potential here. That spring could supply water to the whole valley. Properly managed, of course. The railroad would be very interested in acquiring—" "It ain't for sale," Isaac cut in. Something flickered behind Klein's pleasant expression, sharp and cold as a blade. "Everything has its price, Mr. Creed. I'd hate to see such a valuable resource go to waste through—" He paused delicately. "Inexperienced management." Before either of them could respond, movement at the edge of the clearing caught their attention. A lone rider approached on a paint pony, his straight-backed posture and distinctive blanket marking him as native. Ella recognized Samuel Two Eagles, whom she'd seen occasionally in town trading furs. Klein's face hardened as he watched the elder approach. "Well," he said, gathering his reins. "We can discuss this another time. Good day to you both." He turned his horse, gesturing for his men to follow. Samuel Two Eagles waited until they'd gone before dismounting. He moved with the deliberate grace of age, his weathered face grave beneath his hat. Isaac stepped forward to greet him, touching his chest in what Ella recognized as a gesture of respect. "It has been many winters, my friend," Samuel said, his English clear but accented. "I see much has changed." His dark eyes took in the cabin, the spring works, and finally Ella. "Samuel," Isaac said, "this is my wife, Ella May." The elder inclined his head. "The people speak of you in town," he said to Ella. "They say you own the healing spring." "Please," Ella said, "come inside where it's warm. I've got stew on the fire." In the cabin's warmth, over bowls of rabbit stew and cornbread, Samuel Two Eagles spoke of things long past. He told them how the spring had been sacred to his people for generations, a place of healing where the Earth Mother's warm breath rose even in the deepest winter. "We cannot claim it now," he said, his voice heavy with old grief. "Treaties move like wind-blown leaves, and boundaries shift like spring snow. But the water remembers. It has its own spirit, its own purpose." Isaac nodded slowly. "I remember you showing me this place years ago when I scouted for the army. You said it was meant for sharing." "Yes." Samuel's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Water gives life. To hold it back is to dam the Creator's love." He looked at Ella. "But there are those who would make it serve greed instead." "Like Klein," Ella said softly. "The railroad man sees only power," Samuel agreed. "He would fence the wind if he could." They talked through the afternoon, sharing coffee and stories. As shadows lengthened, Samuel rose to leave. At the door, he turned to them both. "You have chosen a difficult path," he said, "but your hearts are good. Remember, water flows where it will, like truth. No one truly owns either." He touched his chest, then reached out to clasp their hands in turn. "May the Creator watch between us until we meet again." They stood in the doorway, watching him ride away, his figure growing smaller against the darkening sky. The first snowflakes were beginning to fall, big, soft flakes that drifted down like feathers. "What do you reckon will happen now?" Ella asked quietly. Isaac's arms settled warm across her shoulders. "Don't rightly know," he admitted, "but we'll face it together." The snow fell harder, adding fresh white to the old. In the gathering dusk, Ella could just make out the steam rising from their spring in the valley below, a constant reminder of God's provision, no matter what storms might come. She thought about Samuel's words regarding truth and water, how both found their own way forward, no matter what obstacles stood in their path. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew now that she and Isaac weren't facing them alone. They had wisdom to guide them, faith to sustain them, and a clear purpose to light their way. Inside the cabin, she stirred up the fire while Isaac brought in more wood. The wind picked up outside, driving the snow against the windows, but within their walls, all was warm and peaceful. For now, that was enough. The winter sun hung pale in the afternoon sky as 3 riders approached the cabin. Ella spotted them first through the window while kneading dough. She recognized Abner Klein's straight-backed figure leading 2 strangers in city suits, their leather satchels marking them as men of business. "Isaac," she called softly, "we have company." Isaac looked up from cleaning his rifle at the table. His weathered face tightened as he watched the men dismount and tie their horses. "Best put on some coffee," he said, setting aside his work. Ella wiped her hands on her apron, grateful she'd swept the plank floor that morning. The cabin wasn't fancy, but it was tidy, a point of pride even out here in the mountains. She moved the kettle to the hottest part of the stove, just as boots scraped on the porch. Klein's knock was sharp and confident. "Mr. and Mrs. Creed, may we come in?" Isaac opened the door, filling the frame with his broad shoulders. "Afternoon," he said, his voice neutral. "Bit cold for social calls." "Indeed it is," Klein smiled, gesturing to his companions. "Allow me to introduce Mr. Harrison and Mr. Powell, representatives of the Western Railroad Trust. They've come all the way from Denver to discuss a matter of mutual benefit." The 2 men nodded, their eyes sweeping the cabin's simple furnishings. Harrison was tall and thin, with spectacles that caught the light. Powell was shorter, round-faced, clutching his leather satchel like a shield. "Please, come in out of the cold," Ella said, her mother's teachings on hospitality overriding her unease. "I've just put coffee on." "Most kind," Klein said, removing his hat. The others followed suit as Isaac stepped aside to let them enter. They settled around the sturdy pine table Isaac had made. Ella served coffee in her best cups, wedding gifts from the church ladies who'd whispered behind their fans during the ceremony. Harrison produced a flask of brandy from his coat. "To warm the spirits?" he offered, his Denver accent precise and cultured. Isaac shook his head. "We don't partake, but thank you kindly." Powell cleared his throat, opening his satchel. "Well then, to business. We understand you possess certain water rights that could be quite valuable to the community's development." "The hot spring," Klein clarified, his smile bright but not reaching his eyes. "A remarkable resource, especially given our harsh winters. The railroad has a proposition that could benefit everyone." He nodded to Harrison, who withdrew several official-looking papers. "We're prepared to offer fair payment, $50 for the deed and water rights, a generous sum for undeveloped land." Ella's hands tightened around her coffee cup. $50 was more money than she'd seen since her late husband's gambling had emptied their accounts. But something in Klein's too smooth manner set off warnings in her heart. "That's right, charitable," she said carefully, "but we ain't looking to sell." "Mrs. Creed," Klein leaned forward, his voice soft with concern. You must understand, this region is growing. The railroad needs reliable water sources for its operations. That spring could serve hundreds of people, not just one household. We already share the water freely, Isaac said. Anyone who needs it is welcome. Ah, but that's not very efficient, is it? Harrison adjusted his spectacles. Modern development requires proper management, infrastructure. The railroad can provide that. And if we still ain't interested? Isaac's quiet question carried a weight that made Powell shift uncomfortably in his chair. Klein's smile thinned. Well, in cases where private property impacts public necessity, there are legal mechanisms. The railroad might be forced to condemn the land for the greater good. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Ella felt her cheeks flush, but she kept her voice steady. Seems to me the greater good is already being served by leaving things as they are. I urge you to reconsider. Klein stood, his pleasant manner cracking slightly. Progress can't be stopped, Mrs. Creed. Better to profit from it than stand in its way. Isaac rose as well, his height making the cabin seem suddenly smaller. I believe we're done here. The other men gathered their papers, avoiding eye contact. Klein paused at the door, looking back at Ella. Think about it, Mrs. Creed. $50 could buy a lot of comfort, more than you'll find up here in the wilderness. After they'd gone, Ella's hands trembled as she cleared the coffee cups. They mean to take it, don't they? Whether we agree or not. Isaac moved behind her, his presence solid and reassuring. They can try, he said quietly. But we've got right on our side, and law too, I reckon. I'm scared, Isaac, she admitted. Not of them exactly, but of all the trouble they could bring. He turned her gently to face him. Then we'll do what my ma always taught me when fear comes calling. We'll take it to the Lord. Together they knelt beside their bed. Isaac's rough hand enfolded her smaller one as he prayed in his simple, direct way. Lord, you know what's in our hearts. You know what's right. Give us wisdom to see your path and courage to walk it. Amen. Amen, Ella whispered, feeling steadier. Outside, snow began falling heavily, filling in the visitors' tracks. The wind picked up, driving white flurries against the windows and piling drifts against the door. The cabin creaked and settled around them like a protective embrace. They sat before the fire that evening, Ella mending a shirt while Isaac carved a new handle for her broom. The flames painted everything in warm gold, but she noticed a shadow in her husband's eyes. What's troubling you? She asked softly. Beyond today's business, I mean. Isaac's big hands stilled on the wood. For a long moment there was only the crack of the fire and the wind's moan outside. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with memory. Seeing Klein threaten what's right, what's sacred, it brought back something I ain't proud of. He set aside his carving. You know I used to scout for the army? Ella nodded, settling her sewing in her lap. There was this skirmish years back, near the reservation where Samuel's people lived. His words came slowly, like pulling thorns from deep wounds. Some settlers had dammed a creek the tribe depended on. Things got hot. There was this boy, couldn't have been more than 12. He was just trying to protect his family's water, same as we're doing now. He fell silent, staring into the fire. Ella waited, her heart aching for the pain she heard in his voice. I was supposed to prevent violence, be a peacemaker, but it happened so fast. Shots fired, people scattering. The boy... Isaac's voice cracked. I couldn't reach him in time. Been carrying that shame ever since. Ella rose and moved to his chair. Without hesitation, she took his large, calloused hand between both of hers. Listen to me, Isaac Creed. That boy's death wasn't your doing. You were trying to help, same as always. Should have done more, he whispered. Maybe so, We can always think that afterward. But you're doing something now, ain't you? Standing up for what's right. Protecting what the Lord gave us to tend." She pressed his hand firmly. "You still saved someone today. Me. From making a fearful choice instead of a faithful one." Isaac's fingers tightened around hers. "You're a wise woman, Ella May." "Not wise," she smiled gently. "Just blessed with clear sight when it comes to good men." The fire popped and settled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the snow continued falling, blanking out the world beyond their windows. But inside the cabin, wrapped in warmth and understanding, Ella felt their bond growing stronger, like a young tree putting down deep roots, ready to weather whatever storms might come. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance. Their joined hands spoke volumes that words couldn't express, about trust, about healing, about the courage found in sharing burdens. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, this quiet moment was enough. The days lengthened slowly as February settled over the mountain. Inside the cabin, warmth spread from more than just the crackling hearth. Ella's presence had transformed the sparse dwelling into something that felt like home. Colorful quilts draped the chairs, their patterns bringing cheer to the winter dark days. The aroma of fresh-baked bread filled every corner, and hymns drifted through the rooms as she worked. Isaac found himself humming along sometimes, surprising them both. His deep voice would join hers on familiar verses of Amazing Grace or Rock of Ages while they did their evening chores. The music seemed to lift something heavy from his shoulders, like spring sunshine melting old snow. "Never thought I'd hear singing in this cabin again," he said one morning, watching her knead dough at the kitchen table. Flour dusted her arms to the elbows, and her face was flushed from the effort. "Well, the good book says to make a joyful noise," she replied, smiling. "Though I reckon my noise ain't always so joyful." "Sounds just fine to me." He paused by her chair, resting his hand briefly on her shoulder. "Everything you do sounds just fine." The simple touch, the quiet words, they were learning this new language between them, built of small kindnesses and growing trust. Ella felt tears prick her eyes, but they were grateful ones. How different from the bitter tears she'd shed in her old life, alone with her shame, and a husband who gambled away their dignity. One crisp morning, they heard shouting from the trail below. Isaac grabbed his rifle, but Ella touched his arm. "Listen, sounds like someone calling for help." They hurried down to find Tom Murphy, one of the younger miners, supporting his friend Matt Cooper. The older man's leg was badly swollen, angry red streaks climbing from a deep gash. "Blood poisoning," Isaac said grimly, examining the wound. "How long's it been?" 3 days, Matt gasped. "Thought it'd heal on its own, but—" He broke off, face gray with pain. "The spring," Ella said firmly. "Its waters have healing properties. The Ute people have known it for generations." They helped Matt to the Sioux steaming pool, now partially enclosed by the wooden trough Isaac had built. The warm mineral water rose around his injured leg as he sat on the bank, supported by Tom. "The heat'll draw out the poison," Isaac explained, "but you'll need to soak it regular-like." While the men tended to Matt, Ella hurried back to the cabin for clean bandages and her jar of honey and yarrow salve. She nearly collided with 2 Ute women coming up the path, their shawls bright against the snow. "I am Morning Star," the elder woman said in careful English. "This is my daughter, Swift Brook. We heard of your kindness with the sacred waters." Ella welcomed them warmly, recognizing them as Samuel Two Eagles' family. "The spring is a blessing meant to be shared," she said, remembering Samuel's words about the water's importance to his people. The women helped her gather herbs and prepare fresh poultices for Matt's leg. Together they worked in comfortable silence, their skilled hands moving in the ancient rhythms of healing. Swift Brook sang softly in her native tongue, a prayer song, her mother explained, for the water's blessing. By sundown, Matt's fever had broken. The angry red lines were already fading, and he could put weight on his leg again. "It's a miracle," Tom declared, helping his friend back to their camp. "We'll tell the others about the spring and about you folks." "Tell them all are welcome," Ella said, "so long as they come in peace and respect." Over the next weeks, word spread through the scattered homesteads and mining camps. People began appearing at the spring, not in crowds, but ones and twos. A mother with a colicky baby, an old trapper with joints stiff from rheumatism, 2 young sisters with winter coughs. Ella kept coffee hot on the stove and bread ready to share. Isaac built simple benches near the spring. Morning Star and Swift Brook often came to help, teaching Ella their ways of using the local herbs and sharing stories of the water's history. The change in the community's attitude came gradually, like ice melting in the sun. The mockery that had followed them from their wedding day began to soften into something like respect. Even those who had laughed loudest found it hard to scorn folks who offered help without judgment. One afternoon, they heard the jingle of harness bells. Reverend Boone's tired mare picked her way up the snowy trail. The preacher hunched in his saddle against the cold. Isaac helped him dismount while Ella hurried to stir up the fire. "Quite a establishment you've got here," Reverend Boone observed, warming his hands at the hearth. His eyes took in the neat cabin, the well-worn path to the spring, the fresh-baked pie cooling on the windowsill. "Folks in town been telling me about the changes up here." "We just try to be neighborly," Ella said, pouring coffee into her best china cup, the one she'd saved from her mother's set. "Neighborly," the preacher repeated thoughtfully. "That's a powerful word when you think on it. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Not always easy to do, especially when those neighbors haven't been particularly loving themselves." Isaac shifted in his chair. "We all need mercy sometimes, Reverend. Reckon it's not for us to decide who deserves it." "Well said." Boone sipped his coffee, then set the cup down carefully. "You know, when I married you two, there were those who thought I was making a mistake, said it would never last. A refined woman and a mountain man both carrying their own hurts." Ella felt Isaac's hand find hers, strong and steady. "But watching you now," the preacher continued, "seeing how you've turned mockery into ministry, hurt into healing, well, perhaps the Lord led you two together for such a time as this." The words settled in the warm air like a blessing. Ella thought of Esther in the Bible, called to an unexpected purpose. How different her own purpose looked now from what she'd imagined that snowy wedding day. After Reverend Boone left, they sat together by the fire, Ella's hand resting light on Isaac's arm. The familiar crackle of burning pine and the tick of the clock filled the comfortable silence between them. Outside, the heavy clouds finally broke, and the endless snow stopped for the first time in weeks. "I've been thinking," Isaac said at last. "Come spring, we could build a proper bathhouse by the spring. Nothing fancy, mind you. Just a simple shelter with benches, maybe a changing room for the women folks." Ella nodded, picturing it. "We could plant herbs along the path, the healing ones Morning Star showed me. Make it a proper place of welcome." "You've already done that," he said softly. "Made everything more welcoming, more alive." She looked up at him, this quiet giant of a man who had offered her dignity when others offered only scorn. Who had matched her faith with his own, her courage with his strength. "We did it together," she said. "That's what matters." The fire settled, sending up a shower of sparks. Through the window they could see stars appearing in breaks between the clouds, the first stars they'd glimpsed in weeks. The long winter wasn't over, but its grip was loosening. Like the spring they tended, hope bubbled up warm and constant, melting old hurts and making way for new growth. In that moment, looking at the peace in Isaac's eyes and feeling the steady beat of his heart under her hand, Ella knew they had won something precious. Not just survival, but purpose. Not just shelter, but home. The laughter that had followed them from the church that day had been transformed into something beautiful, into healing, into community, into love. The first warm days of spring brought a gentle thaw to the mountains. Snow melted in trickling rivulets down the slopes, and patches of muddy earth began showing through the white blanket that had covered the land for months. The changing season stirred Isaac to action. It was time to begin work on the bathhouse they'd planned. Early one morning, he hitched up the wagon for a trip to town. The trail was treacherous with half-frozen mud and lingering ice, but the mules picked their way carefully down the mountain. Ella packed him a lunch of cornbread and dried apple, tucking it into his coat pocket with a gentle pat. "Mind you check if there's any mail from my sister," she reminded him. "And don't forget to price those window panes for the bathhouse." Isaac nodded, touched by her attention to detail. "I'll be back before supper," he promised, gathering the reins. The ride into Mercy's Bluff took longer than usual with the poor road conditions. By the time Isaac reached town, the morning sun had warmed the air enough to turn the streets into a mess of boot-sucking mud. He tied the mules outside the lumber yard and spent an hour selecting boards and posts for the bathhouse frame. "Fixing to build something substantial?" the yard manager asked, tallying the order. "A proper bathhouse," Isaac replied, "for folks who need the spring's healing." The man nodded thoughtfully. "Good idea, that. My missus says those waters did wonders for her joints this winter." With the lumber arranged for delivery, Isaac headed to the land office to check on their water rights paperwork. The bell above the door jangled as he entered, ducking his head under the low frame. The office was empty except for young Jimmy Porter, the clerk, who looked up from his ledger with an oddly nervous expression. "Morning, Mr. Creed," Jimmy said, his voice catching. "What brings you by?" "Just checking our spring registration," Isaac said, approaching the counter. That's when he noticed the new notice board behind Jimmy's desk. Among the various land claims and sale announcements, a fresh document caught his eye. Official-looking paper with red stamps and flowing script. His heart dropped as he read the title. Notice of Mineral Rights Claim, Rocky Mountain Railroad Company. Below it, in precise lettering, was a description of their hot spring property. Ella's name had been struck through with heavy black ink. "What's the meaning of this?" Isaac demanded, his voice low and controlled despite the anger building in his chest. Jimmy shuffled papers on his desk, avoiding Isaac's eyes. "Mr. Klein's men filed it yesterday. They're claiming the spring under mineral rights laws on account of the water's properties. That spring belongs to my wife. We have the deed." Jimmy swallowed hard. "They brought documentation showing prior claim. Said Mrs. Creed's ownership was never properly recorded after her first husband's death." Isaac's hands clenched into fists on the counter. "Those papers are forged, Jimmy. You know that." The clerk's face reddened. "Mr. Klein's men said the courts would sort it out. I had to post it. It's my job." "Your job is to keep honest records," Isaac growled, "not help thieves steal what ain't theirs." Jimmy finally met his eyes, and something in the young man broke. "They threatened my position," he whispered. "Said if I didn't file their claim, they'd have me replaced. But—" He glanced around the empty office, then quickly pulled a folded paper from his desk drawer. "I made a copy of what they brought in. The signatures don't match other documents I've seen. Isaac took the paper with steady hands, though his heart was pounding. "Much obliged, Jimmy. You're doing right now." "Be careful, Mr. Creed. Mr. Klein's got powerful friends. They're saying the railroad needs that water for their steam engines, and nothing's going to stand in their way." Isaac folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his coat. "The Lord stands in the way of wickedness, Jimmy. Best remember that." He left the land office with purposeful strides, forgetting about the window panes and mail. The mules sensed his urgency as he untied them, and they made good time despite the muddy trail. The afternoon sun was still high when he reached home, finding Ella in her kitchen garden, clearing space for spring planting. She looked up at the sound of his early return, worry crossing her face at his expression. "What's happened?" Inside, they spread Jimmy's copied documents on the table. Ella's hands trembled as she read the railroad's claim, but her voice was steady. "They're trying to steal it outright now. No more pretending at fair offers." "We need proof these papers are false," Isaac said. "Your first husband's will would show clear ownership passed to you." "The will?" Ella pressed her hands to her face, thinking. "Mr. Whitaker, the lawyer in Denver who settled James's debts, he has all the original documents. I never thought I'd need them again." Isaac moved to the fireplace and stirred the banked coals. "How long would it take to get word to him?" "There's a telegraph office in town now," Ella said. "But Isaac, court proceedings could start any day. Abner Klein won't wait long to press his advantage." Isaac straightened, decision made. "Then we'll send that telegram today. I'm riding back to town." "I'm coming with you," Ella said firmly. "Those are my papers they're trying to steal. I need to write the message myself." The ride back to town was tense, but determined. The telegraph operator raised his eyebrows at their urgent message to Denver, but said nothing as he tapped out the request for documents. The reply could take days. As they drove home through the gathering dusk, Ella reached for Isaac's hand. "What if the will isn't enough? What if they find some other way to take it?" Isaac squeezed her fingers gently. "Then we'll find another way to fight. The Lord didn't bring us together and show us this purpose just to let it be stolen." They pulled up to the cabin just as the last light faded from the sky. The spring bubbled steadily in the darkness, its steam rising like a promise. Inside, they knelt together by the fireplace, hands clasped in prayer. "Lord," Ella whispered, "give us wisdom to know the right path. Give us strength to walk it, and give us patience to wait for your perfect timing." Isaac's deep voice joined hers. Amen. They sat in the firelight afterward, studying the copied documents and making plans. The warmth of their faith wrapped around them like a blanket, stronger than any paper claim or railroad man's schemes. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The days stretched like molasses in winter as Isaac and Ella waited for news from Denver. Every morning, Isaac would pause in his chores to watch Ella make her way down to the hot spring, her shawl pulled tight against the late winter chill. She carried her mother's old Bible and a tin cup of coffee, settling on a smooth rock to keep vigil over the steaming waters. Isaac mended fences with steady hands, though his mind wandered to the papers they awaited. The barbed wire needed replacing where snowdrifts had pressed it down. His 2 milk cows watched him work, their breath making clouds in the cool air. He'd added them to his stock just after marrying Ella, knowing she'd want fresh cream for cooking. Now their soft lowing kept him company as he worked. "Keeping busy helps the waiting," he muttered to himself, driving another post into the half-frozen ground. From his position on the ridge, he could see Ella below, her familiar form a comfort against the stark landscape. At midday, voices carried up from the spring. Isaac straightened, watching as 3 miners approached Ella. He recognized them from town, rough men who worked the silver claims up valley. They stood too close, their laughter sharp and mean. "Well, if it ain't the fat fortune herself," one called out. "Sitting pretty on all that hot water while honest folk freeze." Isaac's hands tightened on his hammer, but he held back. Ella had insisted on facing these confrontations herself. "The Lord's my strength," she'd told him. "I need to show them I ain't afraid." Sure enough, Ella rose calmly from her rock, keeping her Bible open in her hands. "Good day, gentlemen," she said, voice carrying clearly. "The spring's open to any who need healing, same as always." "Healing?" Another miner spat into the snow. "That water's worth money, woman. You're just sitting on it like a hen on eggs." Ella's voice remained steady as she quoted, "Better is a little with righteousness than great revenues without right." The miners shuffled their feet, thrown off by her calm response. After a few more muttered comments, they moved on, leaving Ella standing straight-backed by her steaming spring. Pride and love swelled in Isaac's chest. His wife was no cowering creature, despite what folks might think. She had steel in her spine and scripture in her heart. The days fell into a pattern. Isaac tended his traplines and livestock, keeping watch while pretending not to hover. Ella divided her time between household tasks and guarding the spring, always with her Bible close at hand. Each evening, they would check for telegram, notices from Denver. At night, they drew closer together, finding comfort in shared faith and quiet companionship. Isaac would light the lamp and open his own Bible, his deep voice rumbling through passages that spoke of patience and perseverance. "The Lord is my shepherd," he read one evening, while Ella mended his socks by firelight. "I shall not want." "That's always been my favorite," Ella said softly, her needle flashing in the lamplight. "Reminds me that waiting on his timing ain't really waiting at all, it's trusting." Isaac looked up from the page, studying her face in the warm glow. The mockery she faced daily had left no bitterness, only a gentle determination that humbled him. "You're teaching me about trust," he admitted. "Never was much good at waiting before." Ella smiled, her cheeks pink from the fire's heat. "Reckon we're teaching each other." On the 6th day, news came that the stage was running late due to muddy roads. The snow was melting in earnest now, turning the mountain paths treacherous. Isaac paced the cabin that evening, restless as a caged bear. "Sitting there watching that pot won't make it boil faster," Ella teased, trying to lighten his mood. "Come help me knead this bread instead." He obediently plunged his large hands into the dough, working beside her at the table. The familiar motions soothed him somewhat. "Just don't like feeling helpless," he admitted. "Whole town's watching and waiting to see what we'll do." "We're doing plenty," Ella corrected him. "We're standing our ground with dignity. We're sharing the spring's blessings, and we're trusting the Lord to deliver what we need, when we need it." The next morning dawned clear and mild. They were at breakfast when they heard it, the distant rattle of wooden wheels and jangling harness that meant the stage was finally approaching town. Ella immediately reached for her shawl. "I'm coming with you," she announced before Isaac could speak. "Those papers are my proof, and I aim to be there when they arrive." They hitched the wagon in record time. The mountain road into Mercy's Bluff was rutted with melting snow, but their mules picked their way carefully down. Other townsfolk were gathering too, drawn by the stage's arrival with mail and supplies. Ella held her head high as they made their way to the post office, ignoring the usual whispers and stares. Isaac walked beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Together they waited as the postmaster sorted through canvas bags of mail. The spring thaw continued around them, water dripping from eaves and running in rivulets down the muddy street. It was as if the whole mountain was holding its breath, waiting with them for what would come next. Isaac studied his wife's face in the morning light, seeing the strength there that so many missed. She wasn't just waiting. She was standing firm in her faith, sure as the mountain beneath them, and he would stand with her, whatever news that stage might bring. The post office buzzed with activity as townsfolk collected their mail. Ella stood quietly beside Isaac, her hands clasped tightly together beneath her shawl. The postmaster, Mr. Jenkins, sorted through the canvas bags with deliberate slowness, calling out names in his reedy voice. Through the front window, Ella spotted 2 of Abner Klein's men lounging against the hitching post. They made no effort to hide their watchful stares. One was cleaning his fingernails with a knife, while the other rolled a cigarette with careful precision. Their presence made her skin prickle. "Mrs. Ella Mae Creed," Mr. Jenkins finally called out. "Got something here from Denver?" Ella stepped forward, conscious of every eye in the post office turning toward her. The envelope was thick, legal-sized, with her name written in neat black ink across the front. Her fingers trembled slightly as she accepted it. "Much obliged," she murmured, tucking it securely into her dress pocket. Isaac's large hand settled protectively at her elbow as they turned to leave. The 2 men outside straightened as Isaac and Ella emerged. One spat a stream of tobacco juice that barely missed Ella's skirt hem. "Mighty important-looking letter you got there, Mrs. Creed," he drawled. Isaac's grip tightened slightly on Ella's elbow, but he kept walking, guiding her toward their wagon. Behind them, the men's laughter carried on the spring breeze. The drive home was tense and quiet. Ella kept one hand pressed against her pocket, feeling the weight of the envelope against her chest. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the muddy road as their wagon climbed steadily towards the cabin. "Best we wait till we're inside to open it," Isaac said quietly. Ella nodded, watching the tree line for movement. The sensation of being watched hadn't left her since they'd departed town. At the cabin, Isaac helped Ella down from the wagon, then began unhitching the team. "I'll get some wood chopped before dark," he told her. "Running low for the cook stove." Ella paused on the porch steps. "Maybe we should wait till morning." "No need to change our habits," Isaac said firmly. "We ain't doing nothing wrong by getting our mail." He selected his axe from the tool lean-to and headed for the woodpile. Inside, Ella lit the lamp and settled at the kitchen table with the envelope. The familiar sounds of Isaac's steady chopping provided a comforting rhythm as she carefully broke the seal. The will was there, along with a letter from the Denver lawyer confirming her late husband's legal ownership of the hot spring property. Her hands shook slightly as she read through the documents. The sharp crack of gunfire shattered the evening quiet. Ella jumped to her feet as more shots rang out. Wood splintered the porch rail, she realized with horror. Through the window, she saw Isaac dive behind the woodpile as another bullet whizzed past. Raucous laughter echoed through the trees. The sprinkled, "Be ours soon!" a voice shouted. Horses' hooves thundered away into the gathering dusk, accompanied by more whooping and gunfire. Ella rushed outside. "Isaac! Stay back!" he called, but he was already rising from behind the woodpile, rifle in hand. He crossed the yard in long strides, scanning the tree line. "Get inside, Ella, now." She backed toward the door, clutching her shawl tight. Her heart hammered against her ribs as Isaac checked the property's perimeter. When he finally returned to the cabin, his face was grim. "They're gone," he said, securing the door behind him. "Cowards, shooting from the shadows." He checked the windows, drawing the curtains tight. Ella couldn't stop trembling. Isaac crossed to her and gathered her close, his strong arms steadying her. "It's all right," he murmured. "I've got you." "They could have killed you," she whispered against his chest. "Warning shots," he said grimly, "meant to frighten us." His hand stroked her back soothingly, but she could feel the tension in his body. "We'll secure everything tonight. No one's getting in here." They moved through their evening routine with careful attention to every window and door. Isaac brought in extra wood and water, ensuring they wouldn't need to venture out before morning. Ella's hands shook as she tried to cook dinner, the usual comfort of familiar tasks destroyed by fear. Neither slept much that night. Isaac kept his rifle close, checking every unusual sound. Ella dozed fitfully, starting awake at the cry of night birds and the creak of wind in the pines. Dawn brought fresh horror. The smell reached them first, burnt wood and scorched hay. Isaac was out the door before Ella could stop him, running toward the barn. Smoke still rose from the charred timbers, though the fire had burned itself out sometime in the night. "Dear Lord," Ella breathed, following more slowly. The barn's roof had partially collapsed, and the interior was a black maze of fallen beams. Their winter hay was destroyed, along with most of their stored grain. A pained braying drew their attention to the smaller corral. Their mule, Solomon, stood trembling against the fence. His tail and flanks were singed, but he'd somehow broken free of his stall before the fire took hold. Isaac approached the frightened animal slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. "Easy there, old friend. Easy now." He ran gentle hands over the mule's burns, while Ella brought water and clean cloths. "He'll heal," Isaac said finally, though his voice was tight with anger. "Burns aren't too deep." He straightened, looking toward town. His face had hardened into lines Ella hadn't seen before. "I'm riding in to confront Abner." "No!" Ella grabbed his arm. "That's exactly what they want. To provoke you into violence, to make you seem dangerous." "They tried to burn our mule alive," Isaac ground out. "They shot at our home. And if you ride in there angry, they'll say you threatened them. They'll have cause to arrest you." Ella tightened her grip on his arm. "Remember your prayers, Isaac. Remember what you told me about that boy years ago and the cost of violence." Isaac's jaw worked silently. His hand strayed to the rifle slung across his back, then dropped away. Finally, he nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "But I'm keeping this close." He patted the rifle. "And I'm setting a watch tonight. There are limits to turning the other cheek." They spent the morning salvaging what they could from the barn. The structure itself was a loss, but some tools had survived, and the grain bins hadn't completely burned. Enough feed remained to keep Solomon comfortable while he healed. Ella worked alongside Isaac, her skirts covered in soot, her arms aching. Every sudden sound made her flinch, but she kept remembering the verse she'd quoted to those miners. "Better is a little with righteousness than great revenues without right." By afternoon, dark clouds were building over the mountains. The air felt heavy with coming rain, or maybe more snow, this being Colorado in early spring. Isaac insisted on making a full circuit of their property before the weather broke. "I'll check the spring too," he said, cleaning his rifle with careful attention. "Make sure they haven't tried anything there." Ella watched him stride away through the melting snow, his broad shoulders straight and determined. Her protector, her partner in this fight. She sent up a silent prayer for his safety, and for the wisdom to face whatever came next with grace and courage. Inside the cabin, she unfolded the Denver documents again, studying the firm legal language that proved their claim. The paper felt fragile in her hands, so much strife over such a simple thing. But it wasn't really about the paper, she knew. It was about power and greed, and the way some men thought they could take whatever they wanted through force and fear. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Ella went to the window, watching the storm approach. Somewhere out there, Abner Klein was probably sitting in his fine railroad office, plotting his next move. But she and Isaac had something he didn't: truth on their side, and faith to sustain them. She touched the cross Isaac had carved above their door. "Lord," she whispered, "give us strength for whatever comes, and help us remember that mercy can be stronger than might." The first heavy drops of rain began to fall as Isaac's figure emerged from the trees. He moved with purpose, rifle ready, watching over what was theirs. Not with violence, Ella prayed, but with righteous resolve. They would face this together, standing firm in faith and justice. As Isaac reached the cabin, the sky opened up properly. Rain drummed on the roof, washing away the smell of smoke and fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, they were safe. Their home still stood. And most importantly, they still had each other. The morning after the barn burning dawned cold and clear. Saddled Solomon carefully, mindful of the mule's healing burns. Ella stood in the doorway, her hands twisting her apron. "Be careful," she said softly. "Don't let him provoke you." Isaac nodded, checking his rifle was secure in its scabbard. "I aim to be peaceful," he said, "but Abner needs to understand we won't be frightened off our land." The ride into Mercy's Bluff took longer than usual. Solomon was still tender from his injuries, so Isaac kept him to a gentle walk. The extra time gave him space to pray and settle his thoughts. By the time the town's buildings came into view, his anger had cooled to steady resolve. Main Street was busy with morning traffic, miners heading to work, women shopping, children racing to the schoolhouse. Isaac dismounted outside the Mercantile, where Abner Klein kept his office. He'd taken 3 steps toward the door when Sheriff Milt Crane stepped out of the shadows. "Hold up there, Isaac," the sheriff said quietly. His hand rested near his holster. "Let's talk first." Isaac stopped, measuring the lawman's stance. "Ain't much to talk about, Milt. Someone shot at my home and burned my barn. You know who's behind it." "I do," Milt agreed, "and I'm handling it. But if you go in there angry, guns will come out, and I'll have to arrest whoever's still standing." He gestured toward the jail. "Come have coffee instead." Before Isaac could answer, the Mercantile's door swung open. Abner Klein emerged, adjusting his silk vest. His smile was razor-sharp. "Why, if it isn't the mountain man himself, come to discuss business?" Isaac's hands clenched. "You call shooting at honest folks business?" "I haven't shot at anyone," Abner said smoothly, "though I heard some troublemakers were causing problems up your way. Shame about that barn." His smile widened. "Course, if you'd accepted our generous offer for that spring." "That's enough," Sheriff Milt cut in. "Both of you, stand down. This is a civil matter now, you hear? Next man draws iron answers to me." A small crowd had gathered, watching the confrontation. Isaac saw faces he recognized, miners who'd bathed in Ella's spring, women who'd started nodding to her in church. They watched with worried eyes. "Now then," Milt continued firmly, "Abner, you head on to your meeting. Isaac, come with me." For a long moment, the 3 men stood frozen. Then Abner tipped his hat with exaggerated politeness and strolled away. Isaac let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Milt steered him toward the saloon instead of the jail. "Figured you could use something stronger than coffee," he explained. Inside, the morning crowd was sparse, but vocal. As Isaac entered, the conversations shifted to the hot spring dispute. He heard his name, and Ella's, spoken with varying tones of sympathy and scorn. "Railroads brought jobs, one miner argued. Can't fight progress. Progress don't need lies and bushwhacking, another countered. That spring's been garrison land 20 years. Widow's got rights, someone else added. My Martha says she's decent folk. Reverend Boone sat in his usual corner, nursing coffee and watching the debate. He caught Isaac's eye and nodded slowly. The Lord works in mysterious ways, he said as Isaac passed. Sometimes he uses the mockery of men to reveal his truth. Isaac settled at the bar beside Milt, who ordered 2 coffees. I know who shot up your place, the sheriff said quietly. But proving it's another matter. Railroad's got deep pockets and friends in high places. The law's still the law, Isaac insisted. It is, Milt agreed, which is why you need to handle this proper, through the courts. He sipped his coffee. I hear your wife's got papers from Denver. She does, Isaac straightened, and we aim to use them. Meanwhile, across town, Ella knocked softly on the schoolhouse door. Classes wouldn't start for another hour, but she knew Miss Clara Wren arrived early to prepare. The teacher looked up from her desk, her face brightening. Mrs. Creed, come in, please. Ella stepped inside, inhaling the familiar scent of chalk and wood smoke. I need help, she said simply. Legal help. Clara set down her pen. Does this concern the spring dispute? Ella nodded, pulling out the will and related documents. I don't know how to make the law hear me, but you know about such things. I know enough, Clara agreed. She began examining the papers with careful attention. These are quite clear, actually. Your late husband's debts were settled, but the spring remained deeded to you. We can draft a proper petition to the territorial court. For the next hour, they worked together. Clara's neat handwriting filled page after page, laying out the facts in precise legal language. Ella provided details about the shooting and the barn burning, which Clara recorded with growing concern. This is more than a property dispute, she said finally. This is about whether might makes right in our territory. Just then, the telegraph office's boy burst into the schoolroom, waving a yellow paper. Message for Mrs. Creed, he announced importantly. From Denver. Ella's hands trembled as she opened it. The message was brief but clear. Will authenticity confirmed. Stop original filing verified. Stop documents legally binding. Stop. Thank the Lord, she whispered, showing it to Clara. The teacher smiled. This is exactly what we needed. I'll add it to the petition. By the time the first students began arriving, they had a complete document. Clara promised to make a clean copy that afternoon. But Ella, she added softly, you'll need to present this yourself. The court must see you're serious. Ella swallowed hard. I've never spoken in court. Then it's time you learned. Clara squeezed her hand. You're stronger than you know. That evening, Ella waited nervously as Isaac read through the petition. The cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the rustle of paper. Finally, he looked up. This is well done, he said. Clear as spring water. When do you aim to file it? Ella squared her shoulders. Tomorrow, if you'll ride with me. I mean to speak for myself, Isaac. With or without a lawyer. He studied her face for a long moment. The frightened widow he'd married months ago was gone, replaced by a woman of quiet strength. His heart swelled with pride. I'll be right beside you, he promised. Every step of the way. Ella smiled, remembering the laughter at their wedding. How far they'd come since then, from mockery to this moment of shared purpose. She picked up her Bible, opening to a marked passage. Be strong and of good courage, she read softly. Fear not, nor be afraid of them, for the Lord thy God, he it is that doth go with thee. He will not fail thee, nor forsake thee. Isaac reached across the table and took her hand. Together they watched the evening light fade beyond their windows, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Outside, a lone coyote called into the gathering dusk. The sound echoed off the hills, wild and free, like the beating of their hopeful hearts. The blast came just before midnight, shaking snow from the pine boughs. Ella bolted upright in bed as Isaac was already pulling on his boots. "The spring," he said grimly, grabbing his rifle. They rushed through bitter darkness, following the steam-lit path. The sight stopped them cold. Where the bubbling spring had flowed now gaped a smoking crater. Broken rock and ice littered the ground. 3 riders spurred their horses up the far slope, moonlight glinting off their backs. "Klein's men," Isaac growled, raising his rifle. But nature proved faster than bullets. The destroyed spring basin had unleashed a torrent of icy runoff, threatening to flood the whole hollow. Isaac dropped his weapon and scrambled down to redirect the flow. "Isaac, careful!" Ella cried. The warning came too late. Weakened by the blast, the upper bank gave way. Isaac looked up as tons of rock and frozen earth crashed down. He tried to leap clear but caught the edge of the slide. It struck him hard, sending him sprawling. Ella's heart stopped. Then training from her nursing days took over. She half slid down the slope, grabbed Isaac under his arms, and somehow dragged him clear. Blood darkened his temple where rock had struck. His breathing came ragged but steady. Back in the cabin, she tended him through the long night. She cleaned the head wound, wrapped it carefully, and kept the fire stoked. Tears fell as she bathed his face with cool cloth. "You saved me that day in church," she whispered, voice breaking. "Gave me a home when no one else would. Now I'll save what's ours." As false dawn grayed the windows, she knew what she had to do. Isaac stirred fitfully but couldn't rise. The court hearing wouldn't wait. With trembling hands but determined heart, she packed the precious will into her saddlebag. She saddled their old mule, leaving water and broth by Isaac's bedside. "Lord, give me strength," she prayed, mounting up. The eastern sky was just beginning to show pink as she pointed the mule toward town. Hoofbeats echoed through Mercy's Bluff's empty streets as Ella guided her mule toward the courthouse. Her skirts bore the gray stains of last night's explosion, and weariness dragged at her bones. She touched the saddlebag where the precious will rested, drawing strength from its presence. The courthouse buzzed with townsfolk as she entered. Abner Klein sat at the front table, his expensive suit a stark contrast to her ash-dusted clothes. His lawyer shuffled papers importantly while whispering in his ear. Ella saw the smirk playing at Klein's mouth and lifted her chin higher. Judge Harrison's gavel cracked against wood. "Court's in session regarding ownership of the hot spring property north of town." Klein's lawyer spoke first, spinning tales of railroad progress and public good. He waved documents claiming mineral rights that stretched back years. Through it all, Abner nodded smugly. When Ella's turn came, she stood straight despite her trembling hands. Unfolding her late husband's will, she read in a clear voice that carried to the rafters, "To my wife, Ella May, I deed the hot spring property in settlement of debts owed, recorded in the year 1873. "Fraud," Klein shouted, but produced no evidence. Judge Harrison frowned, studying both claims. The courtroom held its breath. Just as he reached for his gavel, the heavy doors swung wide. Samuel Two Eagles entered, his presence commanding instant silence. In his weathered hands, he carried a yellowed map marked with tribal boundaries. Walking to the bench, he spread it carefully. "This spring," he said quietly, "lies on neutral ground. By treaty of 1862, it was never ceded to railroad or town. It remains as the Creator placed it, for all people's use." The courtroom fell so quiet, Ella could hear the clock ticking. Judge Harrison studied the map, his expression grave as minutes stretched like hours. Weeks passed like melting snow, each day bringing fresh changes to the valley. Word of Judge Harrison's ruling spread through the territory. The spring would remain open to all, held in trust by the creeds with respect for Ute traditions. The railroad company, facing public scrutiny, withdrew their claims quietly. Abner Klein was last seen boarding an eastbound train, his dreams of empire dissolving like morning frost. At the spring, healing flowed in more ways than one. Samuel Two Eagles brought members of his tribe to help redirect the water's course, their knowledge of the land proving invaluable. Isaac worked alongside them despite his bandaged head, his strength returning as surely as the water found its path through broken stone. Together they cleared debris and built new channels, watching with satisfaction as steam rose once more from the pools. In the cabin above, Ella tended Isaac's wounds with gentle hands, her touch carrying more medicine than any doctor's remedy. Their evenings filled with quiet laughter now, the kind that comes when trust has been tested and emerged stronger. Outside their window, purple wildflowers pushed through the last patches of snow near the spring's edge, their petals dancing in the warm vapor. On a bright Sunday morning, they gathered the community for dedication. Reverend Boone raised his hands over the flowing water, blessing what they now called Creed's Hot Springs. Children splashed in the shallow pools while their parents waited their turn, sharing stories of aches eased and spirits lifted by the healing waters. Most remarkable were the faces Ella recognized from her wedding day, the same ones that had whispered and laughed behind raised hands. Now they approached with grateful smiles and downcast eyes, offering baskets of fresh bread and jars of preserved fruit. Each thank you helped wash away old hurts, like the spring itself, turning bitter memories sweet. Isaac stood beside her, his arms strong around her waist, watching their community gather in peace around the steaming waters. What had begun in mockery had ended in blessing, as sure as winter gives way to spring. Summer spread its golden warmth across the valley, turning the meadows to rippling seas of grass and wildflowers. The evening air hung sweet with pine as townsfolk gathered around Creed's Hot Springs for the dedication. Colored paper lanterns swayed from poles, casting rainbow light across the steaming pools. Their glow reflected off the water like fallen stars, turning the mist into a shimmering veil. Isaac Creed stood tall and straight, his wounds now healed to little more than memory. The bandages were gone, replaced by new smile lines around his eyes. Ella stood beside him in her best calico dress, her fingers laced through his. She'd sewn fresh curtains for every window in their cabin and planted marigolds along the path, small touches that made their home shine like her heart. As the sun slipped behind the mountains, more people arrived. Wagons and riders came from as far as 3 valleys over, drawn by word of the healing waters and the story of love that saved them. Samuel Two Eagles led a group from his people, their drums carried with reverence. They settled on blankets spread near the spring's source, where the water bubbled up pure and endless from the earth. Reverend Boone removed his hat, his white hair catching the lantern light. "Friends," he called, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "we come together tonight to dedicate these waters, not to any one person or people, but to the Lord's purpose of healing and peace." He raised his hands over the spring, and the evening grew still except for the soft percussion of Ute drums, keeping time with the water's flow. The hymns began softly, Amazing Grace rising first from settler voices. The drums wove through the melody, binding the songs together like branches of the same tree. Children sat cross-legged near the pools, their faces bright with wonder as steam curled around them. Even the crickets seemed to pause and listen. Through the crowd, Ella spotted familiar faces, men who'd once worked for Abner Klein. They stood at the back, hats held respectfully in work-worn hands. When they caught her eye, they dipped their heads in greeting. Ella answered with a gentle nod, forgiveness flowing as naturally as the spring itself. Some wounds, she had learned, healed best in warm waters and gentle hearts. Isaac squeezed her hand, drawing her attention back to the moment. He gazed down at her with eyes full of pride and tenderness. Then he turned to face their neighbors, his voice quiet but carrying clear as a bell through the evening air. "They laughed when I married her," he said simply, "but the Lord knew better." Ella's eyes filled with tears that caught the lamplight like diamonds. She remembered that cold Sunday morning when laughter had followed them from the church. How far they had come, how much love had grown from such rocky soil. Now the same community that had mocked them stood witness to God's greater wisdom. The dedication ended as the stars emerged, pinpricks of light in the deepening blue above. Families gathered their children, sharing final cups of coffee and slices of Ella's apple pie. The Ute drums faded to silence, but their rhythm echoed in the heartbeat of the land. Isaac and Ella walked home hand in hand along the familiar trail. Behind them, steam rose from the spring like a blessing, catching starlight and lantern glow. Their footsteps fell in easy rhythm, matching the peace in their hearts. No words were needed. They had found something rarer than gold in these mountains. They had found love that could turn mockery to respect, division to unity, and wounded hearts to healing springs. The night air carried the scent of pine and wild roses, and somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote sang to the stars. But here, between the woman everyone had laughed at and the man who saw her true worth, there was only gratitude and the quiet certainty that God's love, like the spring itself, never ran dry. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.